Hey everyone, Richard from Digital Foundry here, and a very special video today as John Linneman and I are actually based here at Guerrilla Games in Amsterdam. And joining us to talk us through the PlayStation 4 Pro enhancements for Horizon Zero Dawn, Giliam from Guerrilla Games. Welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Well, I guess you're welcoming us to your
Yes,
fantastic
indeed, yeah.
office. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. We've had a brilliant day getting to grips with the technical minutiae of Horizon Zero Dawn, and we'll be producing more content based on that soon. But yeah, today we're just going to be going for a bit of a deep dive into how Guerrilla managed to create one of the best 4K PS4 Pro implementations that we've seen. So, over to you.
Well, it's quite an introduction.
It is, yeah. I mean, I think from our perspective, John's put in a huge amount of work into the game. When I saw it at the PlayStation meeting, I thought it was easily, alongside Days Gone, it was just a superb 4K presentation to the point where the hardware shouldn't be capable of doing this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, I mean, can you walk us through how you actually did it? What were your starting points, and what are the core techniques that you used to get this fantastic presentation?
Right, well, let's start at our regular 1080p rendering. We have a strong focus on anti-aliasing. So whatever technique we wanted to use for having 4K rendering, that also needed to be of that same quality. And obviously the PS4 Pro is a lot more powerful than the standard PS4. But rendering natively would have been too much to ask, perhaps. So we had to be clever about it, and there's a number of techniques that allow you to do that, including checkerboard rendering. And we use checkerboard rendering at 2160p.
Okay.
So that's half of the pixels rendered per frame, and the other half is coming from the previous frame.
Right.
Ending up at a native resolution detail level.
Mm-hmm. And there are two samples from the current frame and two samples from the previous one, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
That's the exact same anti-alias, and we get therefore as in the 1080p version. We also have a way to sample from the current frame and the previous frame to come up with two samples per pixel per frame, and therefore 4 samples per pixel in total, assuming temporal reprojection can be done.
Right, and you were actually experimenting with a number of different techniques before you settled on the checkerboarding, is that right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. We also tried rendering natively at a lower resolution to see how much we could push that to the native res and see how that would look when compared to our checkerboard rendering. So we had a bunch of techniques side by side. And we concluded that for us it made sense to go for the method of rendering that gave us the most detail.
Right.
Because interestingly enough, even though you only render 50% of the pixels on each frame, you after 2 frames do get the detail level. So not per se the same sharpness as 4K.
Right.
There are maybe also ways to do that, but we focus mainly on the detail. So. Compared to maybe a really rough or a really clean 4K native rendering of a CG scene, I guess our game doesn't have that same crispiness.
Right.
But then again, if you look at a typical 4K movie, it doesn't have that crispiness either.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you look at edges, lines, they're typically like 2-3 pixels thick.
Yeah.
There are some exceptions probably as well, but the main benefit from our perspective of 4K was the amount of detail we could push in the vegetation, in the leaves, in the distance, in the mountains.
Yeah. And
that's also something that is more visible from a slightly larger distance. Because that turns into anti-aliasing basically.
Yeah.
And you do get the feel that there's something there even though you can't see it as crispy as you may have seen it when you're really up close.
I mean, temporal reprojection, temporal supersampling, it does tend to add a kind of a softening of the image anyway, so even at 1080p Horizon, there is that same kind of presentation, right?
Yeah, that is correct, yeah.
Yeah, but some things we were noticed when we did our analysis. John, you noted what looked like higher anisotropic filtering
I
and
noticed
higher detailed textures.
It seemed like the texture filtering was improved and some of the textures actually appeared sharper. But in reality, I mean, none of the assets have changed, and you didn't do anything with the anisotropic filtering. It's just a byproduct of the checkerboard rendering method that you went with.
Yeah.
It looks really good.
Like I said, the amount of detail is native res, and that means you also sample the textures at a higher mid level.
Right.
Or lower, depending on how you define it, and that really helps in that case. Compared to the 1080p, it is still a lot sharper.
Right.
But the amount of detail that you get is even more compared to 1080p. So that's a balance between sharpness and detail. The information that's in there is slightly different for the 4K version.
And of course, you guys did actually design the HUD system and all the text and everything to render at native 4K then,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So it's
Some
very
elements
crisp.
are rendered at native res. That's correct.
Okay.
So you were telling us earlier, PS4 Pro obviously has extra memory for handling the 4K buffers, and you were saying that the UI actually occupies more memory than the 3D elements. Is that correct?
Well, I don't think it's more memory, but it is indeed a big chunk compared to the 1080p version. The same element takes 4 times as much memory, and we don't actually have different assets for 4K and 3D, but we do have them for 2D.
Okay, so the UI
the ratio is
native on 1080p and
exactly.
4K.
Yeah.
Okay, so you swap in the correct one depending on.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent stuff. Good stuff. And also, one thing we were talking about earlier, one thing which kind of drives us to distraction when we're playing on PC is that we can render in-game a beautiful 4K and video sequences 1080, sometimes even lower.
Oh yeah.
Obviously, the older the game, the further back you go, the lower quality the video assets. But Horizon is probably the first one first title we've seen where the video assets are pristine 4K as well.
Yeah, that's correct. We captured a number of sequences
and HDR
in HDR in 4K, and the same assets are also used on the base PS4 because that can also do HDR and SDR, but then at 1080p, obviously. And we found a way to compress the HDR information using an extra channel. So next to the SDR, the typical RGB information, we have an extra channel that allows us to reconstruct the HDR. So for us, it's mainly a ratio between the SDR and the HDR that is additional information that we can therefore apply by having that information side by side. So it's the same stream, but for SDR we ignore a channel, and for HDR we apply it.
And how much space did the actual full motion video sequences take up? Because I know with the Killzone 3 and such, you dedicated a whole layer of the disc just to video clips. And there's fewer video clips in Horizon, but I'm curious, at 4K with the HDR channel inserted, how much, kind of a rough idea?
No, I wasn't part of planning for the disk space, so I can't tell you what we allocated for that. But I do know that for HDR we didn't have the budget on disk to store extra information, but because that information is rather sparse and is very correlated to the RGB itself, we didn't actually have to allocate extra memory on disk for that.
Okay, fair enough. Obviously, there is the sort of perception that you guys have been rendering HDR, since the PS2 era, correct? Killzone 2 had an HDR pipeline.
Yeah.
So, there's a kind of perception that it's simply a case of supporting a 4K HDR TV is simply a case of turning the HDR on, but you were saying it's not quite as simple as that.
Sadly, it's not.
Right. Okay.
Well, I'm sure that for some projects it can be as simple, but the Killzone series as well as Horizon have been influenced a lot by the art direction, and so we have a very deep pipeline for color correction, for example. Okay. And traditionally that was all in SDR. So after the whole scene is rendered in HDR, it was converted using a tone mapper to SDR, and then the color grading happens, and that's what you output. So in theory, you could say, well, skip the whole step going from HDR to SDR and do all the tone mapping.
That's kind of what you think, generally,
Yeah, but color correcting in SDR and HDR are two different things, and we kept the same pipeline as we had for SDR, just because we are used to that most of the users are probably using SDR, so we wanted to keep that as our main target to color correct against, or color correct for. So that doesn't mean we didn't want to give HDR the appropriate time to also be tweaked. But we did feel it was better to focus on SDR and then convert to HDR. And it also has some other benefits, like what we talked about with the movie compression, having a separate channel for conversion from SDR to HDR, because we have that in our movie and we have that in our own pipeline, going from SDR to going from HDR to SDR and back to HDR. That same information can therefore be used both for the decompressing of the movie as well as in our regular real-time pipeline. So therefore we can have the same look in HDR for the pre-captured stuff.
And is there a performance implication of this? I mean, is it kind of like extra performance to support HDR?
In theory, not per se performance-wise, but bandwidth-wise.
Right, of course.
Obviously, you have to be very careful when managing your buffers not to get extra color banding, for example. Because the extra bits do take up bandwidth, and especially when you're also trying to do 4K, it really matters. Every bit matters. So to be very careful with planning your whole pipeline, your post pipeline, in order to not to get severe color banding. And we did change some things in our pipeline, especially in order to get us to a point where both the SDR and HDR have most of the pipeline the same, and at the very end it splits. For before we had a more linear pipeline at the very end when it comes to UI rendering, and that also cost us some. Yeah, it's a bit technical, I guess, but
yeah, I think
we needed more channels and as well as more depth in our.
So before you added the HDR, you would tone map down and then add the UI on top. Is that correct? And then with HDR, you've got to figure out where the UI sits in a pure HDR pipeline.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
that's
you
correct.
mentioned earlier there was issues to consider with the HUD or with the UI elements. Like if you look at the sun, which is an extreme brightness level, for instance, and you place the UI over that, you initially ran into issues with basically the brightness levels of the two superimposed. How did you guys solve that exactly?
In our case, we tried blending linear over perceptual by going back and forth from linear to perceptual blending and so on. That cost us obviously some performance, but that did fix most of the issues when it comes to having text render over the sun.
Right.
But we ended up with trying to be as linear as possible in the UI and still add that on top of the perception. So in theory, it is possible that you would have a text that's blown out by the sun, but it all depends obviously on the alpha that you use for the background of your UI. So it is a hard problem to fix, I guess, because you want to, if you go away from the linear look, you start having some artifacts basically that you don't want. So it's all trade-off when it comes to the quality and the performance.
Okay.
One thing that fascinated me was that there's almost kind of linear scaling in performance between base and pro hardware, when obviously there isn't a linear scale in their hardware capabilities. And that some elements of the pro are massively faster than base, and other elements you only get like an incremental boost. So can you tell us a bit more about how you balanced it to be just so?
We have a pretty deep pipeline with a depth prime and a geometry pass, like a typical deferred renderer, and a lighting pass, and a lot of post effects. For us, the depth prime and the geometry and the lighting was faster, even in checkerboard native, than it was on 1080p on the base. So that saved us. That created some headroom to get a bit more out of the post effects. Because, for example, with the checkerboard resolving, you need a bit more leeway performance-wise. And also, a lot of the effects later on are at a higher resolution and require you to sample more texture. So the bandwidth is becoming more noticeable than, for example, when you compare to earlier on in the geometry pipeline, where it's mostly the computing power, the raw computing power, and not so much the bandwidth. So different passes have different ratios of gain of 1080p versus 2160 checkerboard. And also, there are different ways to do checkerboarding as well. You can have more information per pixel or less information per pixel when rendering checkerboarding, and depending on how much information you have, you can go for different checkerboard resolve techniques. And we came up with one that doesn't need a lot of extra data at sort of per pixel level, and that gave us some performance boost as well in the rendering of the whole geometry and lighting pass. So we have a bit less information per pixel than a base reference implementation, for example.
Okay.
And that's when you compare it, I think it would give you a slightly smoother look, less sharp look.
Yeah.
But it does allow you to more brute force the 2160 checkerboard. So it's a bit of a quantity trade-off. You can maybe have 1800p checkerboard rendering, in our case at least, with more whistles and bells attached to it.
Right.
So have more sharpness in those 1800p checkerboard pixels, versus have a little less sharpness in 2160 checkerboard. But you do have 2160 checkerboard, so you do have that little extra detail in the geometry and the texturing, for example.
It's a fascinating trade-off, and also when you look at a 4K screen like this, there's so the pixel density is so insane that you actually have a little bit of leeway to choose.
Yep.
You know, I guess it will depend on maybe on your assets, on your pipeline to see which looks best.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think from my perspective, I really wanted to see a top-tier AAA Sony first-party title running at 2160p. If only for the bragging rights, but it still looks awesome. So yeah,
Thank you.
Great stuff on that. So you've got a debug build of the game here.
Yeah.
What can you show us?
Well, this is the game on pause. Let me get my mouse back.
Did I?
It's locked. There it is again. So yeah, we have a lot of debug options here that we can turn on and off. I'm not sure how much you can actually see in this capture. But one of the things that we had to figure out how to cope with is in general with HDR is that you don't have a good reference HDR TV readily available. So, for example, we can tone down the whole image to see a different bracket,
Right.
and you would sort of turn down the exposure of an ideal TV to bring it back to a luminosity level that your TV can show. So that did allow us to push HDR further than the current gen HDR TVs actually can show.
Right. Okay.
Which is dangerous if you obviously can't see it yourself.
Yeah. And obviously you can't deploy $4,000 Sony TVs to every artist's workstation in the.
That's also an issue.
Right.
Yeah, but even those TVs don't reach the full range of HDR yet.
I think for GT Sport they've like authored the assets to what was it like 4,000 nits or something, some crazy peak brightness that no display can currently do. But sometime in the future maybe we'll get to see it. Yeah, it's fantastic stuff.
I think. If I'm not mistaken, the maximum brightness that we can emit, like if you look at the sun, would be 6,000 nits. So yeah, there's no display that shows the sun.
Our LG OLEDs are something like 700 or 650 or something at the moment.
It's a lower, but the minimum brightness or the minimum darkness level that it can do is much richer than an LCD. So you still get that large range between the maximum brightness and maximum darkness, and I think that helps it look quite good.
Okay, so finally, obviously you put a lot of work into this particular 4K implementation for PlayStation 4 Pro. I mean, going forward, where would you go from here?
Well, it's hard to say exactly. It depends a bit on the title that you're working on, I guess. But for Horizon Zero Dawn, I don't think we exhausted all the options that we have when it comes to offering a different experience. Obviously, you don't want to have any disadvantage for a base PS4 player, so you want to enrich the experience, which sort of limits you to the options and the difference that you can have. And we chose for this particular product to have a highest resolution option as well as a performance mode that gives you a better frame rate. And that makes a lot of sense for a lot of users we try to cater for. We're really proud of what we came up with for Horizon Zero Dawn. And it's interesting to see what other companies will also do.
You must be watching that very closely. I mean, it's kind of uncharted territory, really, to see how they're actually going to be using the hardware, and basically, you know, we are on the first rung of the ladder, really. So yeah, fascinating stuff. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks for watching. Please do like, subscribe to support what we do, and hopefully we can do more of these sort of developer deep dive chats in the future. But for now, thanks for watching.